May 12, 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 4 days. In a makeshift processing camp near Regensburg, Bavaria, a column of German women auxiliaries stood in the late morning sun, their Wehrmacht grey uniforms faded and dusty from weeks of retreat. The smell of diesel exhaust from American trucks mixed with the scent of pine forests surrounding the compound. These women, radio operators, clerks, anti-aircraft gunners
if you would
from
please
the
come this way, General. We are
had spent
expected
the
inside.
final weeks of the Reich in chaos, fleeing westward to surrender to the Americans rather than face the advancing Soviets. They stood now behind coils of barbed wire, watching young GIs unload wooden crates from a deuce and a half. When one of the soldiers tore open a crate and revealed loaves of white bread wrapped in waxed paper, something unexpected happened. The women began to laugh, not nervous laughter, but genuine, mocking amusement. To them, the bread looked artificial, comically pale and possibly soft. It couldn't be real food. It had to be some kind of American joke. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany had
situation in the
consumed
sector is
itself from within.
stabilized. We will
The
proceed with the
thousand-year
planned
Reich,
logistics
which had once
adjustments
stretched
starting
from
tomorrow
the
morning.
Atlantic to the gates of Moscow, had collapsed into a nightmare of rubble and starvation. For more than 5 years, the German civilian population had endured rationing that grew progressively more severe. What began as limitations on butter and meat evolved into a catastrophic food crisis. By 1944, the official daily ration in German cities had fallen to approximately 1,300 calories, barely enough to sustain life. Black bread, dense and sour, made from rye mixed with sawdust and ground chestnuts, had become the staple of survival. Women queued for hours in bombed-out streets for a single loaf. The bread was so heavy it could break a plate if dropped. Its color was nearly black. Its texture was gritty, and it often contained impurities that caused stomach ailments. But it was bread, and bread meant survival. The concept of white bread, soft, light, made from refined wheat flour, had become a distant memory, a relic of peacetime prosperity that seemed as remote as the days before the war itself.
It seems the Western Front is
These women
collapsing
standing in
faster
the
than they
Regensburg
report.
camp had been told for years that
I wonder what
America
this means
was
for
weak,
us now.
decadent, collapsing under the weight of its own cultural degeneracy. Goebbels' propaganda machine had painted a picture of a nation
They can lock us
divided
up,
by
but they
racial
can't stop the
conflict,
thoughts.
crippled by economic
No, I
chaos,
suppose not.
incapable of sustaining
We still have
prolonged
that, at
war
least.
effort. The United States, they were assured, was a land of gangsters and unemployment, where the people were soft and the government corrupt. German newsreels showed breadlines in American cities from the Depression era, replaying the images year after year to convince the
that's much
population
better.
that Roosevelt's
Just
America
keep it dry
was
and you'll heal
teetering on the
quickly.
edge of collapse. And yet here were the Americans.
It's
their
supposed to rain
soldiers
later this
well-fed
afternoon.
And clean uniforms.
Good, the garden could use it.
Unloading crate after crate of supplies with a casual abundance that seemed almost obscene. The women laughed because the bread looked wrong. It didn't look like real bread. It looked like a confection, a prop from a film set. How could a nation at war produce something so white, so soft, so impractical? Surely it was a facade, proof of American superficiality. An American lieutenant, a young man from Nebraska with dust on his boots and a clipboard in his hand, watched the laughter and said nothing. He had seen this reaction before. The distribution began. Each woman was handed a loaf of white bread, still faintly warm from the field bakery. The waxed paper crinkled in their hands. Some held the loaves at arm's length, as if they might contaminate. Others squeezed the bread, and seemed startled by its softness, the way it compressed and then slowly expanded back to shape. One woman, a former telephone operator from Hamburg, held the loaf to her nose and inhaled. Her expression changed. The laughter began to fade. Another woman tore off a piece and placed it in her mouth, then another and another. The compound fell silent. What they tasted was not simply bread. It was the physical manifestation of everything they had been told was impossible. The flavor was mild, slightly sweet, with none of the bitterness or grit of the Kriegsbrot they had choked down for years. The texture was impossibly light, almost weightless. It dissolved on the tongue. It required no effort to chew. For women who had spent months gnawing through dense, sawdust-laced loaves that left their jaws aching, this was a revelation that bordered on the surreal. But more than the taste, more than the texture, it was the realization that crashed over them in that moment. This was ordinary bread for the Americans. This was not a luxury. This was not reserved for officers or party officials. This was what the common soldier ate. The implications were staggering. If this was ordinary bread, what else had they been lied to about? The records from American POW camps in 1945 document this phenomenon repeatedly. In camps across southern Germany and Austria, German prisoners, both military and auxiliary, were fed according to the Geneva Convention standards, which the United States meticulously followed. The daily ration provided to prisoners included white bread, canned meat, powdered milk, chocolate, coffee, and cigarettes. A standard prisoner meal provided approximately 2,500 to 3,000 calories per day, significantly more than the average German civilian had consumed since 1943. Reports from camp administrators noted the prisoners' initial disbelief. Many assumed the food was a temporary display, a psychological operation designed to soften them for interrogation. They expected the rations to dwindle after the first few days. They never did. Week after week, the white bread kept coming. The canned meat, the coffee, the fruit preserves. It never stopped. Some prisoners gained weight in captivity. This was not supposed to happen. Prisoners of war were supposed to suffer. Instead, they were eating better than they had in years. One woman, whose name appears in declassified camp records only as prisoner 3471F, a former Blitz medal who had served in an anti-aircraft unit outside Berlin, wrote in a letter later recovered by Allied authorities, "We laughed at their bread because it looked like cake. Then we tasted it, and we understood we had lost the war long before the armies met. A nation that can feed its soldiers and its prisoners such bread while we starved on sawdust is not a nation that can be defeated. We were told they were weak. We were told they were starving. We were told they would collapse. We were fools." The letter was never sent. It was found in her belongings after she was repatriated to the Soviet zone in 1946. The symbolism of bread runs deep in human culture, but in Germany it carried an almost sacred significance. The concept of Brot, bread, was tied to survival, to the land, to the German identity itself. The Nazi regime had weaponized food, using hunger as a tool of control both domestically and in occupied territories. Millions had starved in the camps, in the ghettos, in the prisoner of war enclosures where Soviet soldiers were deliberately left to die. The Reich had built its empire on extraction and exploitation, stripping occupied nations of grain and livestock to feed the homeland, and when that was no longer enough, the population was fed lies along with their sawdust bread. They were told sacrifices were necessary. They were told the enemy was suffering more. They were told victory was imminent. And then they were captured by the enemy and handed a loaf of white bread that shattered every lie at once. The American abundance was not accidental. It was the result of an industrial and agricultural system that the Nazi leadership had fundamentally misunderstood. The United States in 1945 was producing not only enough to feed its own military and civilian population, but also to supply Britain, the Soviet Union, and millions of liberated Europeans through Lend-Lease and relief programs. American factories operated at a scale that German planners had deemed impossible. American farms, mechanized and vast, produced grain surpluses that could fill fleets of cargo ships. The women in the Regensburg camp were confronting the reality that the United States had fought a two-ocean war, built the atomic bomb, supplied half the world, and still had enough white bread to feed its prisoners without a second thought. This was not the nation Goebbels had described. This was something else entirely. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. For the German auxiliaries, many of whom were young women in their late teens and early 20s, the collapse of the Nazi narrative was sudden and total. They had been raised in the Hitler Youth, indoctrinated in schools where maps showed the inevitable expansion of the Reich, where racial science was taught as fact, where the Führer's voice crackled from radios in every kitchen. They had believed, or at least they had tried to believe. And now they stood with American bread in their hands, and the entire structure of meaning collapsed. Some wept, others sat in silence for hours. A few refused to eat, though hunger eventually overcame ideology. The bread became a recurring presence in their captivity, a daily reminder that the world was not what they had been told it was. In the weeks that followed, as the camps processed thousands of prisoners and displaced persons, the white bread took on an almost mythic quality. Stories spread among the German POWs. In some camps, prisoners began to hoard slices, keeping them wrapped in paper as if they were valuables, not because they feared starvation, but because they wanted proof that this had happened, proof that the Americans had fed them better than their own government ever had. Some of these slices were carried back to Germany, shown to family members who refused to believe the accounts. The bread became evidence, a tangible refutation of everything the regime had claimed. The transformation was not universal. Some prisoners clung to their beliefs, insisting that the food was a trick, that it couldn't last, that Germany would rise again. But for many, the bread was the beginning of a long and painful reckoning. It forced questions that had been suppressed for years. If they had been lied to about American weakness, what else was a lie? If the enemy could treat prisoners with such relative decency, what did that say about the camps their own government had built? If a democracy could produce such abundance, what had the authoritarian efficiency of the Reich actually accomplished besides ruin? The lieutenant from Nebraska, whose name is recorded in the camp logs as First Lieutenant Robert Harmon, later wrote in a letter to his wife, "They laughed at the bread. I don't think they meant to be cruel. I think they genuinely couldn't believe it was real. When they tasted it, you could see something break in them. Not their spirit. Something else. A kind of certainty. They realized they'd been lied to, and that realization was harder on them than the surrender itself. I felt sorry for them, which is strange to say about the enemy, but they were just women, and they'd been fed lies along with bad bread for too long." By the summer of 1945, the camps began to empty as prisoners were processed, interrogated, and released or transferred. The German women auxiliaries were among the first to be repatriated, sent back into a Germany that no longer existed, to cities reduced to rubble, to a society that would spend decades grappling with what it had become. They carried with them the memory of the white bread, a small thing, absurdly small in the context of the war's vast destruction, and yet profound. It was the moment they understood that the conflict had never been a contest between equals. It had been a delusion fed by propaganda and enforced by terror, and it had led only to ruin. The bread did not absolve. It did not erase the crimes committed in the Reich's name. It did not undo the years of complicity and denial. But it did something else. It revealed the fundamental asymmetry of the war. One side had fought to dominate and enslave, and in doing so had starved its own people. The other side, for all its flaws and contradictions, had fought with a productive capacity so vast that it could feed even its enemies. The women who laughed at the American bread and then fell silent had encountered a truth that no amount of propaganda could suppress. Freedom, for all its messiness and inefficiency, had fed its soldiers and its prisoners. Tyranny, for all its speeches about strength and sacrifice, had fed its people sawdust and lies. In the end, the white bread was not a symbol of American virtue. America had its own darkness, its own hypocrisies, but it was a symbol of a choice between systems. One system had burned itself out in a frenzy of conquest and cruelty, leaving its population to starve in the ruins. The other had built enough to fight a global war and still have surplus. The laughter of the German women and the silence that followed marked the moment when ideology met reality and could not survive the encounter. They had been told that democracy was weak, that abundance was a lie, that sacrifice and struggle were the only paths to greatness. And then they had tasted the bread, soft and white and impossibly real, and they had known, in a way that no speech or pamphlet could convey, that they had been wrong. The war had been lost long before the guns fell silent. It had been lost the moment the Reich chose hunger over plenty, lies over truth, and cruelty over the simple, quiet dignity of a loaf of bread, shared even with the defeated